Hello, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview. My guest today is Professor Peter Brand. Peter Brand is Professor of Egyptology at the University of Memphis in Tennessee in the United States. His specialty is the early Ramessid period, the reigns of Sety I, Ramesses II, and the political and cultural legacies of this important phase. Most notably, his first book, The Monuments of Sety I, examined the reign of this pharaoh from the perspective of his architectural legacy and how that reflects his political, religious, and cultural ideals. More recently, his newest book, Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, explores the legacy of Sety I and the spectacular reign of his son, often called Ramesses the Great. Professor Brand sat down with me in April of 2023 to continue our discussions on the early Ramessid period and its fascinating history. Once again, it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Brand. Okay, so Professor Brand, welcome back for your second discussion with the History of Egypt podcast.
It's good to be back.
How are you today?
Doing very well.
Very good.
Excited about my new book.
Yes, Ramesses the Ultimate Pharaoh is now available. You must be very relieved to have it out there on the shelves.
Yes, it's a long time coming, and I'm very excited to have everybody be able to see it now.
How long was the project for this particular book?
Well, I've been working on it really for 10 years, but the original idea goes back more than 20. Shortly after I finished my doctoral dissertation on Sety I and published my first book, which was a very scholarly book on Sety. I had the idea I wanted to do more with Ramses, and I also wanted to, I wanted to do a more accessible book that, not just Egyptologists or scholars. And so that was the original idea, and I did a lot of various research projects related to different aspects of the king's reign, the royal family, the foreign relations. So drawing all these threads together over the course of really 20 years, and then writing up this book. And people ask, well, how long did it take you to write it? And I said, well, it took me about 2 years to write the book, but then it took me another 8 to perfect it to where people would want to actually read it.
That's excellent. So essentially, from the start of your your postgraduate academic career, you have just been up to your eyeballs in the early Ramesside rulers and their accomplishments. I guess the obvious question would be, are you sick of them yet? But the more pertinent question would be, if you had to sort of summarize, what it really attracts you to these figures in terms of just personal interest and research, how would you summarize that interest?
Well, the short answer to am I sick of them is no. I do find the period and these kings, the monuments, to be just endlessly fascinating. I guess I do have a kind of personality that when I become interested in something, I like to just dive very deeply into it. But as I say, I was captivated ever since childhood with these grand monuments, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, etc. But I remember when I was a child looking at these old National Geographic magazines that my dad had collected from the 60s about the rescue of the temples of Abu Simbel. There was also this National Geographic documentary, and this was long before the cable TV documentaries, but it was about Egypt, and it had a theme about Ramses II and the Temple of Sety at Abydos and the epigraphic survey. And I knew that's what I wanted to study, and that's what I wanted to do, is record the inscriptions and study Ramses and Sety. And I watched this again recently. It was called Egypt Quest for Eternity, and they talked about Abu Simbel and the peace treaty and Seti's temple at Abydos and the epigraphic survey. And this show, it predicted my career. Even my mentor, Bill Murnane, from the University of Memphis, but he was then at the Chicago House. He was like a cameo, but everything in that show is like that's what I became, and it was really quite something.
So, Egypt Quest for Eternity by National Geographic was the documentary.
Yeah, it was from I think the early '80s, and it was what inspired me.
Okay, well, for those interested, the documentary seems to be available on YouTube in its full form. So if you're interested in what inspired Dr. Brand in his early beginnings, that is available on YouTube. So I would like to quickly touch on Bill Murnane. He was obviously a mentor and a very close figure in your life up until his passing. But William Murnane is also very noteworthy in the Ramessid field for his very important study of Sety I's war reliefs at Karnak and reconstructing some of the political and historical events surrounding those. We're going to touch on the wars of Sety I a bit later in the interview, but I'd just like to sort of briefly, if you don't mind, reminiscing, how involved were you in those sort of studies and discussions with Bill? What was your relationship with him, and how much did that really put you on this path?
Well, I became fascinated by this, the art and science of epigraphy. Again, going back to that National Geographic thing, I just remember seeing, these giant folio books with these exact drawings of the hieroglyphic inscriptions and elaborate scenes, and then how they made these precise drawings of all the scenes and hieroglyphic texts. And I knew that's what I wanted. And of course, when I came to the University of Memphis and Bill Murnane had this project to work in the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, it was just like a dream came true. And I finally was able to come out with him in the early 90s. I think 94 was my first season to work there. It was literally my dream come true. And he also he trained me in this very fine art of how to interpret these inscriptions, how to copy them, and there's a subtlety to it, how to discern very fine details and the subtleties of reading. Sometimes it's almost reading between the lines. These often you see these beautiful inscriptions on a tomb or a temple wall that are very well preserved, but all too often the inscriptions are badly damaged. And you have to figure out what is in the missing bits. And especially in this time period, and it's very common in the hypostyle hall, because the Egyptians wrote their history on the monuments, when they rewrote history, they rewrote the monuments. Or sometimes for other reasons, they altered inscriptions. And you can see the evidence of a second hand as they came back and recarved inscriptions. And a major piece of my dissertation work on Sety was his tendency to actually rework his own inscriptions for various reasons. Not out of a desire to suppress his own work, but just to sort of re-edit his inscriptions. And learning how to do this and how to spot these modifications and then discover the reason for why he was doing it. Because there were various reasons why he did this. Sometimes to his own work, sometimes to the work of other pharaohs. And we're going to be talking about this with his restoration inscriptions. But it's almost like forensic work, except instead of studying a crime scene or you're studying an ancient monument, but it's a kind of detective work, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think there's a saying that every detective has a crime that they were never able to solve. Is there one that keeps you up at night with its intangibility?
I can't think of a specific example, but yes, there are things that are impossible to know. To me, it's what are missing. Here's an example, a couple of examples. One of them that is very unlikely we will ever know, and then another one that it's hiding in plain sight that I would dearly love to know, but I'll probably never see it in my lifetime. This is the Sety battle scenes. On the north face of the hypostyle hall, arranged on 3 levels, which we call registers. On the top level of the Sety battle scene, which is mostly gone. On the west side of the battle scenes, we have the battle that shows Sety assaulting Kadesh. But on the east side, the top register of scenes is completely gone. It may have shown some of Sety's campaigns in Canaan and Lebanon. It may have shown one of his wars in Nubia. Who knows what it's shown, but not a single block that can be identified with one of his wars there has survived. they've completely disappeared. And unless they turn up somewhere, we'll never know what those wars were about. I don't think that they are likely ever to turn up, and certainly not most of them. So that is a mystery that is almost certainly never to be solved. Now, on the western side, the way the hypostyle north wall goes, the reliefs sort of turn around a corner. And there are a couple of scenes that are preserved on the western side that are there. In fact, they're probably perfectly intact and probably still even covered with some of the original paint. But unfortunately, they're covered by a later wall that was built in the Libyan period, the Bubastite period. It's part of the outer courtyard of the Karnak temple. And unless you could convince the Egyptian authorities that you were going to dismantle part of this wall, which is not very likely that you could actually do that, and then it would cost thousands and thousands of dollars, that we're very unlikely that we will ever be able to see what's under that wall. So it literally is hiding in plain sight. So those are mysteries that will never be solved or are unlikely to be solved. I would dearly like to know what is there, but I probably will never be able to see them.
Very good. That's a very, very comprehensive answer. I like that information about the Libyan period wall. That must be frustrating. Every time you go to Karnak, you see that wall and you think, I know you're there. Just let me in. Yeah, understandable. Okay, so Sety I is often renowned as one of the sort of great builder pharaohs. And this begins, despite his surprisingly short reign, maybe somewhere between 12 to 14, 15 years, he accomplishes quite significant things in terms of architecture and art. But when he first comes to power, when he inherits authority from Ramesses I, he does begin a small-scale project of what you have termed secondary restoration work at various sites throughout Egypt, most notably Karnak and Luxor. So just very briefly, what is a secondary restoration? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to take issue with one thing. Okay. I think that his reign lasted for more along the lines of about 10 or 11 years, but okay. If you want to talk about, we can talk about that later. Sure. His program of restorations, now we know that in the aftermath of the Amarna period, that beginning with Tutankhamun, that when the images of the gods and the names of the gods, especially Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, that were defaced on the walls of temples, especially in Thebes, had been, defaced by Akhenaten at the orders of Akhenaten. These post-Amarna pharaohs and Sety I had piously restored them. And especially with Sety I, it was quite obvious that he had done a lot of this because he often inscribed in the margins of the scenes that he restored what we call a restoration inscription, which is a brief formulaic text there with slight variations, basically says a restoration of monuments which Sety I made for his father Amun-Re, with various little minor. The phrase that is used in Egyptian is Samawi Menu, which means restoration of monuments. And when other kings like Horemheb and Tutankhamun, and in one case occasionally used these Samawi Menu or restoration labels, but Sety used them on a wide scale. And it was so common with Sety that one would imagine, if you took it at face value, that many of these monuments had lain in a decrepit state, with the icons of the gods completely unrestored, just a mass of chisel marks, as gaping wounds on the facades of the temple for as much as 25 or 30 years from the death of Akhenaten until the reign of Sety I. But already in a couple of instances, other scholars, including Ray Johnson of the Epigraphic Survey and Susan Bickel, who was working, a Swiss scholar who was working in the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, had noticed that there was evidence that occasionally, when they looked at some of Sety's restorations, there seemed to be evidence that the images of the gods that had been restored by Sety, that there was evidence that they were recarved, that they may have been restored earlier and then Sety sort of re-restored them by making minor adjustments to the proportions of the restored images of the god, and then slapping on a restoration label, one of these Samawi Menu texts, where the earlier kings had never added one. And so this was interesting. And when I started looking at Sety's restoration inscriptions and looking at these restored icons systematically, then cases of these modified, restored icons, where all these telltale extra lines. And what you see when you look at them is you look along the outlines of the figures of the gods, and certain things, especially along the arms and legs, or with the god Amun along the lines of the tall feathers on his headdress, you see these extra double lines, where again they haven't completely wholesale changed everything, but they've sort of modified the proportions. Even with Amun's tall plumes, sometimes they adjust the angle of the plumes or make them slightly taller, this kind of thing. And they're really just sort of fiddling around with the proportions. They're not completely wholesale recarving anything. It's almost like he's doing a little bit of modification to justify that, oh yeah, I've re-restored them, so now I can justify the fact that I'm now slapping on a restoration label to say that I've done this restoration. There were a couple of cases where I found this before Sety. In the sixth pylon at Karnak, there was a case where Horemheb had modified images of the gods that had been restored by Tutankhamun. And in fact, there was interesting because Tutankhamun had restored this one image in particular of the god Amun, and he had left a restoration inscription, the same type, Samawi Menu, restoration of monuments made by Tutankhamun. And the image of Amun was standing next to an image originally of Thutmose III, and the Thutmose was still in his original condition. Only Amun had been defaced. But when Tut restored the image of Amun, he was kind of small. He was sort of shorter than he should have been. And when Horemheb re-restored him, he actually made Amun taller, actually be the right height. Next to the king, and you could actually see this because when you looked at the image of the final Amun of Horemheb, you could see the head and shoulders of Tut's Amun embedded in the chest of Horemheb's Amun. And then when you looked at the cartouche in Tut's restoration inscription, you could tell that the name of Horemheb had been added later. And so this kind of thing was a phenomenon. There was also one where the same thing seems to have happened in a case of Ai at Luxor Temple, where Ai had re-restored some of Tutankhamun's Amuns in a gateway at Luxor Temple. So it was an original thing that Sety had first done, but Sety sort of took the ball and ran with it and did this on a large scale throughout Karnak, Luxor, and probably other temples.
Okay. When they did this, when they made these changes, would they have covered the original carving, with plaster and paint? Would they have been invisible once the work was completed?
Yes, because sometimes, and again, I don't know how much plaster was really necessary in some cases, because some of these modifications were so minor, it really was kind of touching up. But I did notice, in particular, there was a case on the eighth pylon at Karnak, where, and especially since the images there were carved in sunk relief, and I looked at these sunk relief images, and of course, because sunk relief has these sort of deep troughs, once you start messing with the proportions of those, you have to cover the trough of the other outline. And there was quite a bit. There were places where the plaster fell away and you saw these parallel trough lines. But there were other places where the plaster was still filling in the earlier version. Now, one of the other things that was useful at the eighth pylon that sort of was the ultimate smoking gun, because people could argue that, well, maybe what you're seeing in these earlier lines is actually not evidence that there was an earlier restoration. Maybe those are just left over from the original Priamarna inscription of the early 18th dynasty. When you actually look at these restored images, even when they've been restored once or twice, there still is a depression that they lay in, and there's still actually residual chisel marks, because when Akhenaten's agents defaced these things, they really went to town on it. They just like hacked it severely. And even when you smoothed it down, there were still residual chisel marks. I found a couple of cases at Karnak where they had unrestored images, and it was just a sea of chisel marks. You couldn't see anything. But on one of the images on the eighth pylon, it was interesting because it was an image of one of the gods, and it was right at the edge of the pylon where it had originally been carved when there was no wall. But then they had added a wall later, and it had partly covered this image of this one particular deity. So when they'd built the wall, just part of the deity's body, his back, shoulder, and leg, was partly covered by this wall. But then Akhenaten had defaced the parts of the god that were uncovered. Then Tutankhamun had moved the god over a little bit and recarved him so that he was whole, and then Sety recarved the part that Tut had restored. Then the wall was removed sometime after the end of antiquity, and now what you see is three versions. You see the two post-Amarna versions, and you see the bit that was covered by the wall that is totally pristine because it was covered in the Amarna period. And there are three versions, which proves that these are real, that these secondary restorations are a real thing. And that was wonderful because it shows that there wasn't a hole in this elaborate theory, that this was a real thing we were seeing. All these double traces were not left over from the pre-Amarna originals. These were actual cases of double restoration.
We call that the glitch in the matrix effect of ongoing work. So Sety's secondary restorations, while in some cases minor, ultimately present him as a re-restorer or a renewer of the monuments, despite earlier work by previous kings. And this somewhat ties into one of Sety's throne names, which is the Wechem Mesut. He presents himself as a kind of Renaissance man. In your estimation of Sety's character, or at least his agenda, is he trying to present himself as a wholly new beginning for the royal machine, the royal system, or is he still very much acting in continuity with what has come before, just making certain changes? Is he presenting himself as kind of a reset?
No, I think the Ramesside kings here at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, they're very conscious that this is the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a new dynasty. And the Ramesside kings are, at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, Sety I, Ramses II are great innovators. On the one hand, just as all Egyptian kings do, they want to look back to tradition. They want to follow in the tradition of the ancestors. At the same time, they want to essentially outdo what the ancestors had done. They want to exceed everything that the ancestors had done that had only been done previously by the Creator God at the beginning of time. The beginning already with Ramses I, I think they are very conscious that this is the beginning of a new dynasty. And just as Ramses I had sort of modeled his titulary, especially his prenomen, on that of Ahmosa, and was conscious that that he was the beginning of a new royal line, just as Ahmosa had been. Sety I, using this phrase Wechem Mesut, the rebirth, the repeating of birth, which actually had sometimes been used by Horemheb, that they are conscious that this is a new royal line. In some ways, they're making a virtue of necessity of the fact that they have no connection whatsoever with the 18th dynasty. and that they are a new royal family and they're making the best of it. They are still following in tradition. They do make a great effort, as we can see with Sety and Ramses II and Abydos, for instance, of promoting the cult of the royal ancestors and claiming all previous kings as nominal ancestors and sort of spiritual ancestors, paying homage to the royal cult. But in terms of their own immediate family, with Sety I promoting the cult of Ramses I as his predecessor, and then Ramses II doing the same with his father and grandfather, that they are a new family, but and their family ties are going to be promoted. So yes, I do think they are seeing themselves as starting a new era, even as they also look back to great paragons of the past. And again, we see that with Sety looking back to great models of authority in the 18th dynasty, such as Amenhotep III and Tutmosis III, the great builder and divine king A3, and then the great warrior pharaoh, Tutmosis III. And you see this in various periods in Egyptian history where kings, especially of a new line, will look back to kings of the previous great age. So at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, kings like Amenhotep I look back to the beginning of the 12th dynasty. At the beginning of the 12th dynasty, they look back to the great kings of the Old Kingdom as models of authority. And I think that's what they still see them as a new, fresh start, but they also want to look back to the previous great age.
Absolutely. I suppose that's perhaps best exemplified in Sety's king list at Abydos. And we'll dive into Abydos, the temple, in more detail in just a moment. But since we're talking about royal lineages, it would be a shame not to touch on this. Sety presents us with a monumental image and encapsulation of the royal heritage and the royal lineage, or more specifically, his version of it. Looking at the king list that he presents at Abydos temple, the first thing that is obviously notable is that certain rulers and periods are left out. Sety presents a very tidy list in which certain names are omitted. There are many reasons why he might leave out some names and focus on others. But looking at the king list overall, what is your sense of Sety's perception of the great figures of the past? Who does he consider illegitimate and who does he consider particularly noteworthy, bearing in mind there's, like 100 names to go through? Do we get a sense from the Abydos king list of his particular version of the legitimate Horuses?
To some extent, and this is especially true for the more recent kings of the 18th dynasty. A couple of things just to keep in mind. One is that of the king list that we have from ancient Egypt, the largest number, in fact, the overwhelming number, are actually Ramesside. And so, although there is one particular one from Karnak in the time of Tutmosis III, the overwhelming majority of them are actually Ramesside, and especially early 19th dynasty, including the Turin king list that's on papyrus. And this really, I think, is no accident. And we have to also understand that what we think of, especially the one at Abydos of Sety and the one of Ramses as well, though not as well preserved, that's in the British Museum, that these are not historical documents. These are actually cultic and ideological documents. They are offering lists that are meant to honor the cultic memory of these kings that Sety and his crown prince Ramses are making offerings to the ka spirits of the deified royal ancestors, to make offerings to their spirits to keep them alive in the afterlife. And therefore, it's an honor roll of kings who are worthy to be revered and whose spirits are to be maintained. Part of the reason for who is on the list, and again, it's not every king that could have been on the list, but part of the reason is there's only so much wall space. So there are any number of kings that are omitted from the list, and this is especially true for some of the earlier kings in the later Old Kingdom, and even in the Middle Kingdom, where there just isn't enough space physically to place them on the list. And it's interesting because the format of the list, there are 3 rows. It's almost like a spreadsheet, a grid of 3 rows. But the bottom row of boxes actually just repeats the name of Sety over, because it's an offering formula, and it's the list of the kings, and then the bottom row tells us that they have all received offerings from Sety. And again, that just shows us the purpose of this list is cultic and ideological. It's not historical. But in terms of the cases that are especially conspicuous by their absence are those 18th dynasty pharaohs that are missing. And in particular, we have Hatshepsut, who is missing between Tutmosis II and Tutmosis III. And then the post-Amarna pharaohs and the Marna and post-Amarna pharaohs, because the list goes from Amenhotep III and then skips right to Horemheb. And these are obviously cases of pharaohs who Sety is considering politically incorrect or ideologically incorrect. That because Hatshepsut was a female and kingship is by definition supposed to be a masculine office, for that reason, she is omitted from the list because she doesn't constitute a legitimate king. And then because of the Amarna period, Akhenaten and all of his successors, and again, we can debate about how many and who they were, but all the kings between Akhenaten and I are considered illegitimate, and therefore they are deleted from the list. Now, it's interesting because if you go back into earlier periods, well, there might have been some earlier kings that might have been at some point considered illegitimate in earlier phases. Some of them are not omitted. In the 6th dynasty, I believe a king named Userkare, who was the successor of Sety, but who seems to have actually overthrown and maybe even was responsible for the assassination of Sety, and who usurped the throne from Pepi I, is actually on the list. And there's some other perfectly legitimate kings of the first intermediate period and the later Middle Kingdom who are admitted simply because there's not enough room in terms of wall space. And so I would say that the clearest cases of omission for ideological reasons are in the 18th dynasty names, whereas before that, the names that are omitted seem mainly have to do with omission based on lack of wall space. Although it's also true that the Hyksos kings are not on the list now that I think of it, and that almost certainly is also for ideological reasons.
Certainly. So we have a sense of Sety I and Ramesses I building on the legacy of what came before, trying to outdo their predecessors, but also acknowledging and, to some respect, leaning into the fact that they are a new lineage, a new household that has taken authority. So one of the classic ways that a pharaoh might establish or promote their legitimacy is through monument building. And Sety I, in his 10 plus years of reign, we'll say, manages to achieve some really significant monuments. The first one I'd like to touch on is the hypostyle hall at Karnak, because you have worked there for many years now, and recently you've been leading the examination and survey of that particular monument. The first thing I'd like to touch on, because in the public discourse, it's sometimes still an issue of controversy, but you seem to have rather settled it in your own analysis. Who definitively started the hypostyle hall, and what is the evidence for that?
Well, there are some, and it's been long suggested, that the central colonnade, the great open blossom papyrus capital columns of the central so-called nave, that resemble superficially the central colonnade of Luxor Temple that you see, that was built at the end of the reign of Amenhotep III and decorated by Tutankhamun and I, has led some to argue that perhaps the central colonnade of the hypostyle hall at Karnak was built in the 18th dynasty. and it's a theory that keeps coming up, and really the only evidence for this is, oh, this colonnade at Karnak kind of looks like the one at Luxor Temple. Maybe Amenhotep III, built it.
Mm.
And variations on this theory have been put forward when there have been suggestions, well, maybe it couldn't have been Amenhotep III, so maybe it was Horemheb. And there's really not been any convincing evidence offered or even rebuttals to various evidence that myself and a few others have put forward for why it can't be 18th dynasty, other than, yeah, but it still looks like it, so maybe it is, or I think it has to be. Some of this is, I think, kind of a kind of 18th dynasty fanboyism.
Sure.
That those Egyptologists that are so passionate about the 18th dynasty just don't want to give credit for certain things as being Ramesside.
Sure.
But in terms of some of the basic evidence that suggests that the central colonnade of the hypostyle hall, along with the rest of the building, is not only Ramesside but specifically Sety I. Because that's another thing. The other arguments that have been put forward for the earliest construction of the hypostyle hall have suggested that maybe the building was started as early as the reign of Horemheb, or perhaps by Ramses I. We know that Horemheb built the second pylon. The hypostyle hall sits between the second and third pylon. Third pylon, of course, is Amenhotep III. And we also know that along the top of the western wall of the hypostyle hall, which is actually part of the wall of the second pylon, that there are some reliefs that depict Ramses I. And for these reasons, it had been suggested years ago that maybe Horemheb or Ramses I had built the hypostyle hall, and perhaps that Ramses I began to decorate the hypostyle hall. And this was in part based on an old theory of how Egyptians decorated monuments. We understand how they built monuments because it was a bit like additive printing. They would lay down the foundations, and then what you would do is you would lay down the first layer of blocks for the entire building. Again, sort of like a giant ground plan of blocks. And then you would fill in the space between with earth, and then you would sort of build ramps on either side made of earth fill or mud brick or sort of a combination. And you would drag up the next layer of blocks for all the columns and all the wall sections and lay those into place. And then you fill it all in between with earth, extend and raise the ramps, bring in the next layer and repeat the process. And at the end of that, the entire building would be completely buried, and the ramps would be extended. And then you would remove the earth fill and a sort of one-way elevator ride. Now, we also know, and we can see this from other unfinished buildings at Karnak, that the walls would be rather rough-hewn, and they would have to smooth them down. But it was also believed that as part of this smoothing down process, that they would also decorate them as they went down. And an early scholar from the University of Chicago had argued that because the scenes of Ramses I were at the top of the wall, that this shows that they were decorating it in this method. But when you look at the chronology of other reliefs in the hypostyle hall, especially reliefs that show Sety I and Ramses II, the chronology of the decoration based on the theory that you were carving the reliefs top to bottom made no sense whatsoever. In fact, in some places, you would actually have to conclude that they were actually digging tunnels into the earth fill to carve reliefs, underground before they had completely removed all, like they were, mining. It just made no sense whatsoever. And there was other evidence, not just from Karnak, but other monuments that suggested that they actually smoothed the walls down as they came down. And then they raised wooden scaffolding to paint the decoration in outline and then to carve it. And in fact, we have also representations in tomb art that shows them using wooden scaffolding to get at, like, for instance, to sculpt giant statues, like in the tomb of Rekhmi, right? So again, one of the parts of my dissertation looking at the temple of Karnak, Hypostyle Hall, was to show that in fact they used wooden scaffolding to decorate large monuments. And other reasons that the images of Ramses I in the Hypostyle Hall were not carved by Ramses I, but were carved long after his death as sort of memorials by Sety later in his reign.
Very good. So based on studies of monuments, we have a very strong idea of the stages of construction, raising the columns first, and then removing the ramps and earth, and then building scaffolding to decorate as they go. Now, I will ask one small question because I know that somebody in the comments is going to ask this, but you have discussed it in your dissertation and your book on Sety. In the 1980s, there was some archaeological work at Karnak, which perhaps erroneously suggested that there were brick podiums or platforms underneath some of the columns, which suggested a late 18th dynasty date. Are you able to quickly comment on that and why that's incorrect material?
Yeah, the problem with the foundations of the Hypostyle Hall is that we don't really have a good understanding, and I think they were fairly heterogeneous. Early reports by the French archaeological mission at Karnak from the early 20th century suggest that many of the columns were supported by piers made from stacks of talatat, but there were also larger blocks. Now, during the first half of the earliest decades of the 20th century, especially after a bunch of columns had collapsed in 1899, it was necessary to actually extract some of these crumbling talatat and replace them with piers of fired brick. And this wasn't often well documented. And I think that for all these reasons, sometimes I wonder whether people were actually discussing modern bricks that were placed there during one of these early 20th century restoration efforts, and then coming to the idea that this was somehow ancient foundations. I mean, fired brick was not really common in the ancient times, and I have no idea why fired brick foundations would be a hallmark of the 18th dynasty and not the 19th dynasty. So it really just doesn't add up. And from what I have seen there's a French Egyptologist that has been looking at old records of the foundations. Mostly it seems to be talatat foundations, but there's also evidence of some larger sandstone blocks that were put under there as well. But there were also the remains of earlier structures that were under there. So, and nobody's really been able to dig under the columns. I would like to get permission. We once got it, and then unfortunately we didn't have time to do the excavations. I would like to do some test excavations between some of the larger columns and in the areas between the larger and smaller columns, because you often also hear suggestions that there are sidewalls between the first row of smaller columns that would have supposedly been the remains of the kind of sidewalls that enclose the colonnaded Luxor temple. But again, nothing like that has ever been found, and I don't think from what we know so far that it's likely to have been there. Plus, if it had been there, and the process of dismantling it and somehow building the Hypostyle Hall's smaller columns, and there would have been it would have been a very unlikely process, and it would have left its mark also on the second pylon of Horemheb. So this old theory of the 18th dynasty lost colonnade of Amenhotep III, for archaeological reasons, for architectural reasons, to say nothing also of the epigraphic reasons, because there's nothing on the big columns that is a single trace that can correspond to any decoration before the reign of Ramses the second, and on the top of the columns, the blocks of Sety the First. There's no 18th dynasty inscriptions or even trace of inscriptions whatsoever. The other thing, one last thing about the architecture is the height of the blocks on the big columns, the small columns, and the walls are of the identical height, which is what you would expect if all of them were being laid at the same time so that you could build them in this manner. Whereas if you had built, the colonnade first and then added the smaller columns and the walls at a later time, then they wouldn't necessarily be of the same height.
Mm.
But in fact, they are of the same height because, of course, they were all built at the same time.
Very good. I like that. Very succinct summary and argument. So I guess a very simple but perhaps meaningful question is, what is the significance of the hypostyle hall significantly? Why would Sety add this particular thing to Karnak? What does it symbolize? What is the meaning of that monument?
Well, I always like to call it the god's living room. Egyptian temples were quite literally mansions of the gods. They were the sort of the public space, or the Egyptian temple basically was a tripart plan: the outer courtyard, the hypostyle hall, and then the inner sanctuary, which has the Holy of Holies and the side chapels and the treasuries and storerooms, etc. And some of the dedicatory inscriptions that describe the function and purpose of the hypostyle hall, it's described variously as a festival hall. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the venue for the festival processions. When the god's sacred bark, its various icons were transported. It's also a place where, when the sacred bark was carried from the sanctuary to go out during festival processions, it could also rest within the hypostyle hall and receive offerings. It was also called a mansion of millions of years, which is a very particular type of royal cult temple, in which the king, as an avatar of the divine king, was worshipped as an avatar not only of his own divinity, but often as an aspect of one or more different gods. And so the deified Sety the First, and perhaps also the deified Sety the First as an avatar of Amun-Re himself, was worshipped here. And later, of course, Ramses II. And you see in the wall inscriptions and images, we see the cult of the deified Sety I. In the north, it's very much about Sety's kingship, and in the south, in Ramses' images, we see a lot about Ramses worshiping his deified father and sometimes his deified self. And there's also an interesting link between the hypostyle hall and the royal cult temple of Sety I at Gourna on the West Bank. I don't like this term mortuary temple that's often used for these cult temples of kings on the West Bank. They functioned during the king's lifetime, and the Egyptians had a name for them. They called them mansions of millions of years. If you want to give them a modern name, let's call them royal cult temples. They were for the cult of the king, and in Thebes, they were the cult of the king as an avatar of Amun-Re. The official name of the hypostyle hall is the divine mansion called Sety I is beneficial for in the estate of Amun, and the Gourna temple is called the divine mansion called Sety I is beneficial in the estate of Amun on the west bank of Thebes. So they're actually parallel foundations, which are dedicated both to Amun and to the cult of Sety I as an avatar of Amun. And as they say, they're linked together.
I'd like to put a pin on the beneficial, because we're going to come back to that word, particularly with a later monument, which is relevant for Sety I. So the hypostyle hall contributes architecturally to Karnak as the sort of the classic house of the god. Why is it papyrus columns? Why is it shaped like that?
Yeah, the very often these types of pillared halls, which we call hypostyle, the Egyptians called them wajit, which basically means papyrus halls from this term that refers to papyrus columns, wajit. And there actually are a couple of wajits from the 18th dynasty in the rear areas of Karnak Temple between the fourth, fifth, and sixth pylons. And there traditionally the columns are made in the shape of papyrus. Now the earlier ones, they usually have these sort of papyrus cluster columns that are like, because you might imagine that a papyrus, the stem of a papyrus is actually round, but in fact it's actually sort of a triangular shape. And the earlier papyrus columns were actually bundle shaped, like you took bundles of these together. Under Sety I, he began to make the smaller columns, which are closed bud. He transformed these bundle papyrus columns that had these corrugated edges. He transformed them into these smooth-sided ones. And the big columns, which did have these round, smooth round sides, except they would put these tiny 3 ridges down 3 sides of them just to suggest the hint. But these left spaces for more decoration to be carved, inscriptions and seams. The big ones to show that the papyrus bloom had opened, and they were in the center, and the closed bud ones, but what it represented, a big clump of papyrus. Now, a temple, again, also was a model of the universe at the dawn of creation. As you entered the temple and you went towards the Holy of the Holies, the ground level would rise up, and in fact, the roof level would come down. So when you came into the sanctuary, you were in the highest point, and the roof was low because you were going back to the beginning of time on the mound of creation that had just arose from the waters of Nun, the primordial ocean at the beginning of time. So the hypostyle hall was the clump of papyrus that grew on the first mound the creator God had created at the beginning of the universe. And so that's what it was, essentially. It was part of this larger model of the creation of the universe. Symbolic.
So essentially, you might say that the hypostyle hall is in stone what the Esheru lake around the Temple of Mut is in actual plants.
Yes, to some extent. And so it really it functions on multiple symbolic as well as functional levels. It's part of this larger temple. It has various symbolic meanings, and it also serves multiple purposes.
So the hypostyle hall was roofed, so most of the time it was dark except for the clerestory windows in the central axis. That brings to mind the monumental entrance to the complex of the step pyramid at Saqqara, which has the bundle papyrus in stone. In that sort of dark space, it would feel very much like you were entering an enormous forest of sorts, wouldn't it?
Yeah. One of the things I'm hoping to do a project on is to actually to build a 3D model of the building and try to replicate the light environment, because the roof structure is only partly preserved. On top of the columns was a massive roof system that consisted of these ceiling beams that are called architraves. And in the south wing, they're mostly preserved. In the north wing, most of them had fallen, although they have these sort of modern sort of concrete and steel maquettes that crisscross. On top of these architrave beams, they laid thinner slabs of stone, which roofed over the ceiling slabs. Unfortunately, these were thinner, and most all of them have fallen away. Although other temples, some of them survived at contemporary temples like Khonsu Temple or parts of the Ramesseum or in Medinat Habu. And of course, in some later temples like Edfu and Dendara, most all of them are still preserved. But we also know from these temples that they also had these light shafts that were in the ceilings. And so in addition to the clerestory roof with these grated big window grills, as well as the doorways that when they were open would have emitted light, there would have been a system of these light shafts. And what we would dearly love to reconstruct and is what this might have been like. And if we could recreate this in sort of a 3D environment, maybe using one of these game engines, and also because the walls would have been coated with brilliant white plaster, and the scenes would have been decorated with colored relief that would have been just as brilliant as the tomb of Nefertari or the tomb of Sety I. What that would have been like, because it may be that it created a kind of ambient light that was a lot, if not brilliantly bright, but a lot less gloomy than we might otherwise suspect.
Okay.
But then the space too, it would have been interesting because on the one hand, you would have been in this forest. But even today, when you go there, in certain directions, you can look and you can see off in certain angles halfway across the hall. But other directions you look and you're sort of surrounded by these massive stone columns. So there's a sense of being closed in, but also a sense of seeing wide vistas. It's sort of a paradox of enclosure and of wide vistas in the same space.
It's surprisingly claustrophobic in some corners, isn't it?
Yeah, but as I say, that's true. But then there are other places where there are large spaces that are open. So it's a unique space in that sense.
In the digital reconstruction, that sounds like a project for Unreal Engine 5. I was just curious whether you saw the Malkata reconstruction that was put up, that was finalized recently by Frank Monnier, I think, which is, you can finally do a little digital walkthrough of the Malkata Palace. Did you see that?
I may have just seen a couple of stills of it. I'd like to look at that. I know also the Giza project has done some wonderful work. So I'm looking into people that can do this kind of thing with the Hypostyle Hall.
It went out on the Egyptology Electronic Forum mailing list, was Frank Monnier's reconstruction of Malkata. It's got a website. It's, you literally click to go through the building. Yes, but that sounds like a digital reconstruction is certainly but a very exciting avenue for monumental study. One thing I will ask, and it might be slightly controversial depending on one's perspective, the Egyptian government is putting a lot of resources into repairing and restoring certain monuments. In some cases, it's very simple cleaning and conserving images, like in the Hypostyle Hall and at Medinat Habu. I'm curious, what is your perspective on a hypothetical proposal to, say, build a wooden roof over the Hypostyle Hall so that one can restore the original appearance in some capacity? Is that something that you think is acceptable or should be done, or not?
I had not actually heard anything about this, to be honest with you.
This is just a hypothesis.
I don't know. I don't think that's the kind of thing you would want to do. Is actually do that kind of intervention. I will say this though. I just went to Egypt for the first time since before COVID in March, and the kind of conservation work that the Egyptian government doing is there. I'd seen pictures of it, but it's really spectacular. They're investing quite a lot of money, and they have a huge team of, I think it's about 100 conservators. They have been cleaning the columns to reveal colors. They had done the central columns. We always knew that there was a fair amount of color on these columns. And you look at these old 19th century pictures that for the likes of David Roberts and some of the others that show a certain degree of paint there. We could still see faded colors before this work was done. Some of the other cleaning work that was done in Khonsu Temple by the American Research Center revealed beautiful colors. There was a lot at Mini Habu. They've done work elsewhere at Dendara, and now at Esna. But I was just floored by seeing how much color they had found, and just the beautiful work they've been doing. And I was also very pleased to see that one of the problems in the hypostyle hall was that a lot of the bases and the lower parts of the shaft of the columns had suffered over the centuries from the groundwater infiltration and the salts, which had destroyed the stone, not just the relief, but even damaging and structurally undermining the stone itself. And where some of them had to be shored up with brick, and very often up until now there was a lot of restoration work that was using cement to cover up these spaces. The problem with the cement was that it doesn't allow the salts in the groundwater to escape, and instead forces them up into the stone. And the American Research Center had been showing more sustainable methods to the Egyptian conservators several years ago of using lime mortar, which allows these salts to come to the surface in the restoration mortar instead of migrating into the ancient stone. And they had done this on a certain scale. And now the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry conservators are using it on a systematic scale. They are also replacing some modern and not really authentic type of column bases in the hypostyle hall, which much more authentic and proper and properly, again, trying to eliminate concrete with natural mortars to systematically repair and to make more authentic the column bases throughout the hypostyle hall. So the work that I just can't say enough good things about the work that the Egyptian Antiquity Service is doing there. It's really spectacular, and it's a great improvement, giving the hypostyle hall the tender, loving care that when you go there and just see the riot of color that's actually on these columns, it's just simply amazing.
Very good. And when do you have plans to return to Egypt anytime soon?
Yeah, so I'm hoping my team will go out to work at Karnak in November and December. We had been working since 2011 on the columns, and I have a former grad student, Mark Jansen, who's at a university in Nashville, Tennessee, Lipscomb, and he has been working for a few years on a sort of sub-project, working on the famous battle scenes of King Merneptah on an adjoining wall next to the hypostyle hall. And recently, we've also just begun working on the famous Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty. But one of the things that I'd left on the back burner for many years that I want to get back to is on the Ramses II battle scenes on the south wall of the hypostyle hall, to resume work on finalizing our record of those, to get back to work on the Hittite peace treaty. And also there is a large section of wall that has an edition of the famous poem text of the Battle of Kadesh on the southeast corner of the hypostyle hall that I would also like to make a facsimile, a definitive publication of that. And so that's what I'm hoping to get to work on. It's going to be several seasons of work to do all of that, but that's what we're hoping to resume work on this winter.
Excellent. Well, watch this space, and we'll look forward to hearing more. My conversation with Professor Brand continues after the break. See you in a moment. And now, part 2 in my conversation with Professor Peter Brand. We have discussed the early monuments of Sety I, most notably the hypostyle hall at Karnak. Now, we turn to some truly grandiose structures, like the King's Temple at Abydos. We recently explored the Abydos Temple in a multi-episode series. Professor Brand has studied this monument extensively for his PhD research and the book The Monuments of Sety I. He shares his insights into the temple, its surrounding complexes, and the religious significance of these projects. So, the hypostyle hall is a very famous monument, but I would be remiss if I did not take some time to ask you about Abydos. Abydos is an enormous cultic site. We don't have nearly enough time to discuss the whole thing. We'd be here all day. But Sety I's major or great monument there is an enormous temple. We'll call it a cult temple for the king. And this is justly famous to many people as one of the more beautifully preserved monuments of New Kingdom Egypt. The wall carving in Sety's areas is exceptional. It has many unique and fascinating scenes and structures. The first thing I'd like to ask, broadly speaking, is what is the significance of this particular temple at this location? Why does Sety build this here?
I think what Sety I is doing, and some of the 18th dynasty kings had also built temples here, is going back to the ancient tradition that goes all the way back to the beginning of Egyptian civilization with the tombs of the first and second dynasty kings there, as well as the tradition dating back perhaps to the Old Kingdom and certainly the Middle Kingdom of building cenotaph tombs, of essentially the connection with the cult of Osiris and the idea of building symbolic tombs here. Of course, what Sety and some of these other 18th dynasty kings before him were doing were building, cult tombs. And of course, Sety also adds this mysterious structure of the Osirian as a kind of symbolic tomb to Osiris, and to some extent, I suppose, himself as Osiris. But of course, what is so unique about his temple, and that's different from all the earlier structures, or for instance, Ramses II's smaller temple that he built at the very beginning of his reign, is that Sety's temple is not just dedicated to himself, or even just to himself and the Abydos triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, and of course, including this, the temple that is involved with the mysteries of the Osiris cult, with this extra suite of rooms dedicated to various festival rites for Osiris, and of course the suite of rooms that's dedicated to the cults of the Memphite gods of Nefertem and Sokar and Sekhmet, who are the sort of Memphite versions in the sense of their funerary deities that are the northern equivalents to the of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, but that also the other great gods of the Egyptian pantheon, sort of the national triad of Amun, Re, and Ptah. And of course, then the royal cult through the cult of the royal ancestors, that it's kind of almost like a national shrine. And it has this unique structure with these 7 chapels dedicated to the Abydos chapel, the great triad of Amun, Re, and Ptah, and then of course the chapel, the royal chapel to the deified Sety. And this unique architectural design with this L-shaped extension with the cult of the royal ancestors and the Nefertem and Sokar suite, all this, everything about this temple is unique, unusual, and of course exquisite in terms of the quality of the decoration.
So should we perhaps call it a pantheon, like the Pantheon in Rome?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. It is utterly unique. One of the other things it isn't just the unusual design of the temple and the incredibly beautiful reliefs, but also it almost reminds me of some of these Greco-Roman temples in just how exotic the iconography is.
Mm.
You never, until the Greco-Roman period, you never see so much unusual and exotic iconography
Mm.
in
What
an
what do you
Egyptian
mean
temple.
by what do you mean by that specifically in terms of the subject matter
Oh,
or the style or
just the subject matter and just sort of the wild and wonderful imagery that
mm.
you see in the temple reliefs. Think about some of the imagery you see, and it's actually in the Nefertem and Sokar suite, but where you see these two versions of the resurrection of Osiris and the conception of Horus post-mortem, where Isis, copulates with the deceased Osiris, and she, perches on his penis in the form of a kite,
Mm.
and all these other just these unusual imagery that you see. It's just extraordinary. You just don't see anything like it anywhere else.
Mm. Why do you think that survives so specifically at Abydos and not at other temples? Is it due to the design and function of the temple, or is it an accident of preservation?
One suggestion that a colleague of mine from New Zealand had, Tony Spallinger, is that if not the high priest of Abydos, a man, I think it's what's his name? There was a high priest at this time, Ramses. I'm sorry, his name is escaping me, but
Mm.
I talk about it in my book. But he was promoted by Ramses II to be high priest of Amun.
Mhm.
But either this man or somebody on his staff was just a brilliant priest who may have been responsible for, with his great imagination, for some of the design of the temple and its imagery, because
Mm.
it just seemed to be somebody or some group of people with great imagination who came up with this iconography, and perhaps also with the imagination to come up with this temple design. It's
Mm.
just very imaginative, and one
Mhm.
just suspects that whether it was one lone genius or a group of them, it just somebody with great brain power was really indulging themselves in building this temple and designing its decoration.
Mm. So, touching on the architecture, the Abydos temple does appear to have a somewhat unique shape with its kind of L-shaped configuration. A sort of an extension moves to the south, where you have the king list, the corridor of the bulls, and the bark shrine for Ptah, I think it is. Why is that extension there and not at other temples, or is it at other temples? We just don't identify them.
No, it is a unique feature, and again, because it's unique, uh, to try to explain why it's
Mm.
I think it goes back to what we were just talking about. It is whoever the genius or geniuses that came up with all other aspects
Mm.
that are utterly unique,
Mm.
it's just part and parcel of what we were just talking about. Why does it have seven chapels all lined up in a row?
Mm.
And before Ramses altered the design, those seven chapels also had seven separate entrances through the portico.
Mm.
So it's all part of this unique design.
Mm.
So asking why is why are any of these
Mm.
unique features of this temple that way? Because some genius came up with it all. I can't otherwise really explain it.
Sure. So architecturally, it's of a whole with the rest of the monument. It's not a later extension.
No, I know this is clearly all part of it, and it wasn't. I mean, the building was by the end of Seti's reign, it was not incompletely decorated.
Mm.
But I think the structure was basically complete in terms of its architecture by the end of Seti's reign. And in fact, we also know, because of the way the temple was decorated, and Seti, using this exquisite bas relief style, perhaps realized that it would take some time to complete all these exquisite carvings. They used we know that traditionally the way you laid out decoration is you would make these quick drafts in red, and then you do the fine outlines in black. And I'm sure if you talked about Horemheb's tomb when the early podcast, you can see that. But at Sety's temple at Abydos, there was another stage after these black and red outlines, was to then, in a simplified palette scheme of white and red and yellow, to then sort of simply paint the images, sometimes in fairly amount of detail, before they were carved. Mm-hmm. And some of these painted drafts still exist. And these go into this section of the temple, some of them partly carved by Ramses II. But they were laid out in paint by Sety I, which indicates that Sety had not just painted them, and obviously had built those parts of the temple too. And again, there's no reason to believe that this isn't part of the integral design. This wasn't just an add-on. This was part of the original design of the temple. And when you see the way even the mud brick structures there, the system of these storage rooms and the miniature palace that fit quite nicely into this in between the main part of the temple and the L-shaped extension, so that the overall structure fits in a nice rectangular design, that it's all part of a whole.
Very good. It's very thorough. Thank you. So again, I know I'm going to get comments or questions about this, so I have to touch on it. So as part of the, we'll call it the Pantheon complex of Abydos, Sety also adds this not unique, but certainly unusual monument at the back, which is often called the Osirion. The first thing to ask about it is, do you view the Osirion as a symbolic tomb for Sety as Osiris himself, Sety as deified as Osiris, or is it more for Osiris individually, even if there's a distinction at all?
Yeah, I don't think that it's likely to have a distinction. I suspect that it's sort of a bit of both. Mm-hmm. Because again, I think if you look in the Sety temple, you can see areas where the Sety's identity merges with Osiris. So for instance, if you look in the 7 chapels, obviously you have the chapel of Sety, and then of course you have the chapel of Osiris, which is just sort of almost like a dummy chapel because the back of it leads into the Osiris suite. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting there is you have in there these 3 chapels, one of which is a chapel of Isis and a chapel of Horus. Mm. But then there is also a chapel which is presumably the chapel of Osiris. Mm. But in that chapel is actually images of the deified Sety I in the guise of Osiris. Mm. Well, mostly in the guise of Osiris. Sometimes he's just the deified Sety, and other times he's clearly the deified Sety in the guise of Osiris. And in one case, he's actually the deified Sety, who is a composite of Osiris and Amun.
Mm. Interesting.
So when I think of the Osirion, to me, it's not really a choice. Is it Sety or is it Osiris? To me, it seems likely to be both.
Mm-hmm. Out of curiosity, why does, well, the why is always difficult with these sort of questions, but we have an example of that monument from Senuseret III of the Middle Kingdom, and then Ahmose I, also at South Abydos. And then, broadly speaking, there seems to be a relative gap during the 18th dynasty of these types of monuments before Sety revives the practice. If you had to speculate, because it is rather speculative, why do you think he might have specifically chosen to revive this type of project at this time?
Well, unless we're just missing some other ones in between, I suspect that this is a case of Sety I looking for older models of authority and trying to revive ancient traditions as a way of legitimating himself by reviving these older types of monuments, these older forms of kingship, and as part of his building program. And so going to Abydos and building this type of building that the glorious ancestors had built, and perhaps that hadn't been built for quite a long time. This is part of his, effort at legitimation by reviving the ways of the ancestors, but to some extent also one-upping them, because again, I suspect that this is quite a bit more spectacular in terms of its scale and complexity than what Senwosret III had built.
Well, it certainly worked, because this temple is now the archetypal cenotaph of the region. Out of curiosity, Ramesses II also builds a small temple just a couple of 100 meters north of Sety's own monument. Much smaller, much less architecturally or artistically impressive. Is there any evidence for Ramesses starting his own Osirion behind that monument?
Well, this is what I'd love to know. I was just recently talking with the excavator, Sama Iskander, and Ogden Galed, and I was talking to Sama. I went to Abydos, and he was working there, and they're doing some excavation. They actually found under the temple evidence of some giant Old Kingdom structure. Ooh. But as of yet, he hasn't found any evidence of a Ramesside, Osirion there. It doesn't mean that there isn't one, but so far he has not found anything yet, although I got the impression he doesn't seem very optimistic that there is one. So maybe, but nothing yet. So
one can only hope. But even if there isn't one, that in itself is obviously instructive and educational. The overall structure, as you say, doesn't distinguish formally or even conceptually between Sety and Osiris. They become largely the same figure. But this does bring me to a topic that you discuss in the new Ramesses II book, which is this growing trend. Sety doesn't invent it, but he certainly promotes it, of deifying a king within his lifetime. And the last time we saw something like that definitively happening is with Amunhotep III and Akhenaten. Again, is this part of Sety's harkening back to older models of legitimation and attempts to increase his own legitimacy? Or based on your understanding of the process as it develops, is this not a new phenomenon, but a new way of doing things for the pharaohs? Does this become common practice?
Well, this is actually something I'm increasingly interested in looking at. I had already looked at the cult of the deified Sety I in my dissertation. I'm going to be speaking at the British Museum for a conference on Ramesside art in July, and looking at the evolution of the iconography and the ideology of divine kingship during the early 19th dynasty. With Ramesses I, of course, he rules for such a short time. If we look at imagery of the king as a divine figure, as a cult icon, with Sety I, we see images of the deified Ramesses I, where he basically looks like a king, being worshipped by his son Sety after his death. Or there's a few images where he's shown as Osiris, and the markers of his divinity that you basically see is he's holding an Ankh sign, and sometimes he sits with the crook, a scepter folded across his chest while he holds an Ankh sign. Otherwise, he's indistinguishable from, if you will, a regular king. With Sety I, we also see this iconography when Ramesses II worships his deified father and his grandfather after their deaths at places like the Gorna Temple. But we also see with Sety I increasingly images of the deified king that are created during his lifetime. We saw, like I was talking about, with the chapels of the deified king at Abydos, both the one of the 7 chapels, but also this inner Osiris chapel where Osiris is substituted for the deified king, including Sety as a stand-in for Osiris, or even Sety as a composite deity that blends Osiris and Amun's iconography. But here again, when you look at the name of this deity, it is the names of Sety written in cartouches. But there's also something that begins with Sety, is when you see the name of the deified Sety written without a cartouche. There is an image also in the Osiris suite that shows Sety worshiping two gods. One of them is Osiris, and behind him is a god dressed like a king with the white crown. But instead of having a cartouche, there are three hieroglyphs that spell out Sety's prenomen, Men Mot Re, the great god, written without a cartouche. And writing a king's name without a cartouche is one way of conveying that he's a deified king, that he is actually a god. And of course, the epithet great god, like other gods, is further laying stress on his divinity. And so, and of course, here he also is shown holding an ankh. There's also at the Gorna temple of Sety I, there's some rooms in the sides of the cult chapels off the hypostyle hall that we see the cult images of the deified Sety I being worshipped by the Yun-Mutef priest, by Thoth and Wetwawit, where the deified king holds a wa scepter and an ankh along with a royal staff. And he's again a deified cult figure. So here we see the transformation of Sety not into just a deified king, but even as sometimes as a kind of divine alter ego. And I think this is something that we'll see Ramses taking up and sort of running with it, but it's already beginning to happen. And I think it's not just a matter of Sety becoming a god in his own lifetime. It's that the king's divine identity is related to, but actually can be partly separate from his human identity. The king could almost have multiple identities, and his divine identity is related to, but actually can also partly be separated from his human identity.
Interesting. So you mentioned the Yun-Mutef priest, which Escher has identified as one of the common titles that the sons of Ramesses II take up during his long reign. In the Kurna temple, is there any evidence that this Yun-Mutef priest is Ramesses, or is it just an official?
Well, the Yun-Mutef priest is traditionally, it's the idea that when a man dies, that his son then conducts the funeral rites, and of course also supports his widowed mother. And the Yun-Mutef means pillar of his mother. There is in the cult of the deified king, there is a priest who's called the Yun-Mutef priest, who is the nominal priest of the deified cult, but a kind of generic Yun-Mutef priest can act in imagery as a sort of a generic stand-in figure. And so in imagery associated with the divine cult, we can see a Yun-Mutef priest who's not a real person. And it's sometimes not even clear whether he's almost supposed to be a deity or a demigod himself. But we also see as a stand-in for the officiant who's conducting the ritual for the deified king, alongside the Yun-Mutef priest, are two deities. One of them is Thoth, and the other one is the god Wetwawit, who's this jackal-headed deity, sometimes thought to be associated with Anubis. Wetwawit is the opener of the paths, the opener of the ways, this guide of the dead who leads them into the underworld. And sometimes also Horus. There's a scene from the hypostyle of Abydos that shows all three of them actually conducting rites for the deified Sety I who is called Menmatre, the great god, but the iconography of Sety's figure looks like he's the incarnation of Osiris. And these three gods, Wetwawet, Thoth, and Horus, attend to this sort of Osiran version of Menmatre, the great god. And so you see all these divine aspects of the cult of the divine Sety the First.
Interesting. So it all comes together quite cohesively in his monuments. There's a consistent trend to whether it's meant to be sort of earthly or simply symbolic or, greater spiritual. There is an increasing trend of Sety and Osiris becoming one and the same individual as part of the overall divinity of the king as it is expressed through ritual worship.
Yeah, and I think this is particularly true here at Abydos. What we see at the Gourna temple is not quite the same thing for the most part. And again, if we had more monuments from elsewhere in Egypt, or had Sety the First ruled for a longer time and built more temples, we might see different aspects of the deified Sety the First, as we did, of course, during the long reign of Ramses II, where we have different aspects of the deified Ramses II, although the main unique aspects of the deified Ramses II were solar, as alter egos of the sun god, as well as some lunar forms of Ramses II. And of course, we do have this sort of combination of Osiris and Amun in one figure of the deified Sety at Abydos.
Interesting. So it's a very large and complicated phenomenon. So touching on, well, actually, that does bring to mind when Sety builds his cult temple at Kurna, which many people might call the mortuary temple. He adds a chapel for Ramesses I. Within, is that a substitute for the fact that Ramesses could not build his own memorial temple? Is there any evidence that the Kurna temple started life as the temple of Ramesses, but then Sety inherited it and completed it? Or is it simply a part, or at least as far as you're aware, is it simply a part of this gathering trend of deifying and honoring the father?
Well, I think it's partly the first and third. On the one hand, yes, Ramses I did not rule for very long, and so there was a motive for Sety to include a suite of rooms in honor of his father. On the other hand, if we look at at some royal cult temples of other kings who presumably did have time to build where the father or the ancestor had time to build their own cult temples, we do see some kings adding a cult chapel for their revered predecessor. So, for instance, at the temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, she actually adds a cult suite for the memory of her father Thutmose I. Because of course her claim to kingship is based on the idea that she's the legitimate successor of her father Thutmose I, and therefore political legitimation, she insists on honoring his memory. We even have the case of Ramses III at Medinet Habu. There's Ramses the 13th, my cat. I'm making his presence known. I'm sorry.
Hello.
But at Medinet Habu, Ramses III dedicates a chapel to the cult of his great ancestor and paragon Ramses II, who of course still had the Ramesseum, etc. But again, for this kind of ideological desire to pay homage to a great ancestor. So there were multiple reasons for why Ramses the first had this suite of rooms at Gourna.
Interesting. So from the son of Ramesses I, we should now very briefly, as we wrap up, touch on the grandson of Ramesses I. In the later years of Sety I, in your book, you touch on the rise of Crown Prince Ramesses. You touch on the rise of Crown Prince Ramesses, who starts to become a more prominent figure around approximately year 10 of Sety I. What is the evidence briefly for Prince Ramesses' rise in the administration or the public image of his father's regime? What do we know about that process?
Well, we have a handful of images, mostly imagery from the Temple of Sety at Abydos, as well as these images from Sety's Karnak War Monument and a couple of private monuments that show Ramses as crown prince attending his father in cultic and at Karnak in military inscriptions. They mark him out as crown prince. They show that he participated in military and cultic activities. Mm-hmm. And then we have these inscriptions during Ramses' own reign, in which he gives these sort of retrospective accounts or sort of little autobiographies of how Sety prepared him to be king and sort of gave him on-the-job training as a future pharaoh. One of them is a dedicatory inscription that he added on the porch of Sety's temple at Abydos that tells how Sety had gave him responsibility for building projects and administrative projects, how he had supplied him with what he actually calls a female household and selected wives for him, and how he began to produce children, etc. There's another inscription from when he's setting up a well for a gold mining operation in Nubia, and the courtiers sing his praises and say that every kind of administrative business and project was under his supervision, that he was a commander of the army even at the tender age of 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And so it makes clear that Ramses had this kind of on-the-job training from his youth, although one can suspect there may have been certain amounts of exaggeration. Was he really a general of the army at the age of 10? Possibly, although one suspects there was a certain amount of symbolism there. But on the other hand, it does seem clear that Ramses did receive extensive training and was introduced to the elite as their future monarch, and that Sety took pains to make sure that not only was his son prepared, but that the elite of Egypt was prepared to accept him as their future pharaoh. And there was a remarkable inscription that was discovered at near Aswan on the island, a small island near Elephantine, that records how Ramses held a title, the great overseer of the army for the monuments of the king, that goes hand in hand with a building inscription of Sety himself that tells us how Sety had commissioned giant obelisks and statues in the 9th year of his reign, which is just about a year or so before his death. Mm. And that inscription of Sety also tells us that when Sety commissioned these large obelisks and statues, that, quote, the king's eldest son was ahead of the officials doing what was beneficial for his majesty. And of course, that unnamed king's son was none other than Ramses. So again, it's clear that Ramses was being promoted as the heir apparent, and that he was well prepared to take over. In fact, one wonders if there was ever another crown prince who was so well prepared to take his father's.
That is a very thorough summary. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So that brings me to the end of all of my questions, but we can now touch on the foreign wars. So just to clarify, you're currently working on a study of Sety's wars. Is that correct?
Oh, well, eventually I want to write a book on Sety that would include. In fact, I had actually written an extensive section. My chapter on Sety was actually originally more than twice as long as what actually made it into the book. And my editor imposed draconian cuts because they were worried that if I didn't get around to actually getting there. And I will say this, I'm actually writing a chapter for a book that Tony Spallinger is putting together on warfare in ancient Egypt. So I'm hoping to recycle a lot of what I'd written about the Sety Wars for this this chapter, and part of it is a focus on the ideological aspects of the Sety War Monument and Sety's wars. And what interests me, both in terms of the war monument itself, and particularly for Sety's first campaign, is that, and this is a major theme of this Ramses book, is that the Egyptian ideological worldview just permeates all of the sources. These monumental inscriptions and these beautiful art, these stunning war reliefs are suffused with an ideological perspective. We can say that it distorts the facts, that it can deceive us. I don't think they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. I don't think Ramses or Sety are trying to lie to us. But on the other hand, they weren't trying to record history or tell us the facts. This imagery served an ideological purpose to glorify the king, to convey the essence of the Egyptian ideology, that the king was the champion of Maat, of universal order, that foreign peoples were the embodiment of chaos that had to be defeated and suppressed. And that was much more important than the mundane details of historical reality. And so when you look at the imagery, that shows the king as a superhuman figure and doing some rather, there's this one scene of Sety in his chariot, and he's standing there. Of course, he's a giant figure, with these tiny little enemies. You don't take that seriously. He's the only Egyptian. There's no other members of the Egyptian forces alongside him, single-handedly defeating these sort of mini tiny little enemies. And he's riding in his chariot. He has one leg hiked up over the front of the cab, bent over with one leg, balanced on the pole of the chariot between the two horses. He's leaning over with one hand upraised, holding his scimitar sword, and with his bow in the other hand, he's looped it around the neck of this Libyan chieftain, as if he's about to strangle him. Really, he's about to cut the guy's head off as he speeds past him in his chariot. Meanwhile, he has the reins of his chariot horses tied around his waist. It's a beautiful image. It's vivid, it's exciting, it's elegant, but it's completely unbelievable. We can't take this seriously, although it's amazing how many Egyptologists do. Again, we can't, they weren't trying to lie to us. We're not supposed to believe it in terms of a literal sense. It's all about ideology. And if you take it from that perspective, it's wonderful, but don't believe it in a literal sense. And everything about these war scenes are all part of that. So with the Sety battle scenes, scholars had spilled gallons of ink trying to decide what order do they read, and how many campaigns they were. We might be able to deduce how many military campaigns Sety led, but trying to use the battle scenes to figure that out is a rather hazardous endeavor. If you look at the battle scenes, we have two wings, the east and west side, which were divided up into 6 total levels of scenes, 3 on the east, 3 on the west. Each register consists of a sequence of scenes. They're almost like cartoon scripts. They're complete narratives. You have scenes that show the king fighting in foreign lands. You have the scene collecting enemy prisoners. You have him marching them back to Egypt. And finally, closest to the central doorway, you have him presenting enemy prisoners and the spoils of war to the gods at Karnak. If you took them totally literally, you would actually conclude that there were 6 separate campaigns. 2 of those on the east side almost certainly refer to the campaigns of his first regnal year. Yet if you take those 2, which refer to the first campaign in Canaan and Lebanon and Sinai, you would have to say that those were two separate campaigns, but they're not. But it just shows you that a literal interpretation of this art is really tricky.
Mm. Mm.
But again, it's not a historical document. We're using it to try to deduce historical facts. And it does have historical information to tell us, but that's not its purpose. That's not why Sety made it. So we have to be really cautious in using it. And this ideology is not just a bunch of mumbo jumbo that we have to sort of get past so we can figure out what the real historical information. The ideology, the worldview, the iconography, and the rhetoric of the inscriptions is actually worth studying in its own. It's really interesting, actually. It's actually quite wonderful. But too often historians just think, oh, that's just the usual nonsense that we have to get past so we can figure out what really happened.
So you're interested in the ideology as its own phenomenon, essentially, as part and parcel of why they're making these particular images.
Yes. I mean, don't get me wrong. I still want to know what really happened and why it happened.
Sure.
But from my view, the ideology is worthwhile studying for its own sake, partly because it helps us understand the Egyptian mindset. But even as a historian who ultimately does want to know what happened and why it happened, sometimes the ideology can actually help us understand why things happened, and it can help us sort out what is ideology from what did happen. I'll give you an example. In the first year of his reign, Sety led this campaign that went across North Sinai and seems to have gone into Canaan as far north as into Lebanon. And the battle scenes on the east side that are preserved show a number of episodes that are battles against the Shasu and one against a city called Yenomam. There's a couple of stelae from a place called Bethshan in what's now Israel that refer to attacks on a number of small cities, Bethshan, Yenomam, and Hamath, that the king's armies defeated in the space of a day, according to Sety. There's only a couple of scenes of actual fighting, but there's a couple of other scenes that show the peaceful submission of the Canaanite and Lebanese chiefs who bow down in homage. The chiefs of Lebanon even cut down cedar wood trees, their most valuable commodity, and offer it up to Sety for free. And even the chiefs themselves cut it down, who've never done a day's work themselves, are forced to humiliate themselves and cut down these trees to give it away to Sety. Well, where's the fighting? There's not a lot of fighting in this first year campaign, according to the battle scenes. What do we do to explain this? Well, I suspect that much of Sety's first year campaign was not so much essentially a series of military conquests. And earlier Egyptologists believed that after the Amarna period, that the empire had supposedly been lost because Akhenaten was asleep at the switch, or he was focused on religion, and the empire went down the tubes, and that Sety had reconquered it. We now know that's not really what was going on. But so there wasn't a lot to reconquer. Sety, in the first year of his reign, who wanted to demonstrate his military credentials and who was itching for a fight, he went on campaign. The word for campaign, wediat in Egyptian, actually means marching around. And so what I like to call what Sety was up to was chariot diplomacy. Now, he was looking for a fight, whoever was foolish enough to give it to him. He beat up on the Shasu Bedouin who occupied Sinai in what was probably something along the lines of a series of drive-by shootings. And, he fought these guys in central Canaan who had been squabbling amongst themselves, and he basically just went in and cracked heads. But other places, the local vassals were wise enough not to tangle with him, and therefore they just paid homage to him, and he received their submission. But even just marching around in his chariots with his army was enough to basically demonstrate his military credentials. And so that much of his campaign was more, again, sort of the ancient equivalent of gunboat diplomacy, or again, I like to call it chariot diplomacy, with relatively little fighting. It was not some kind of ancient reconquista, with Sety basically reconquering all of Canaan and Lebanon that had supposedly been lost, during the Amarna period.
Certainly, I mean, we now have increasing evidence of warfare under the later reign of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and then, Horemheb is able to go as far north as Carchemish. He's not doing that if the entire country is hostile to him. You need a safe space to launch that kind of attack.
Well, yeah, and there's no question that the Egyptians had lost their hold on the northernmost provinces in Amru and Kadesh to the Hittites. And there are even some Hittitologists nowadays that are saying that the Egyptians really never had control over Amru and Kadesh. But in terms of Canaan and even Lebanon, those really never had slipped from their grasp. And especially Canaan, there was no question that those were safely under the Pharaoh's thumb all throughout the late 18th dynasty. So there was nothing for Sety to reconquer there. Now, it is interesting that, like his predecessors in the late 18th dynasty, Sety was hell-bent on taking or retaking Amru and Kadesh, unlike most of his predecessors, and unlike Ramses II. Sety gained some temporary victories, and in fact, he did take Kadesh. And although his battle scene from Karnak that shows the conquest of Kadesh is a typical battle scene, you could say, well, he was making it up. But we did find at the site of Kadesh a battered victory stela of Sety I, which suggests that he did manage to take the citadel. And so it seems fairly safe to conclude that Sety had conquered the place, although in the end, he couldn't hold on to it. And so within a fairly short period of time, whether it was months or a few years, it reverted to the Hittite control. And therefore, Ramses, a few years later, in the 5th year of his reign, had to march back once again and make one last, ultimately unsuccessful bid to once again try to wrest Kadesh from the Hittite control.
And it's interesting, with your description of Sety's chariot diplomacy, and just thinking in terms of his repeated and conscious hearkening back to glorious predecessors, there are aspects of it which are very similar to the Megiddo campaign of Thutmose III, which is, I think, on the Beth Shan stela, there's implications that local rulers had risen up in rebellion, perhaps testing the new pharaoh's resolve. But with his speed and Ma'at's blessing, he's able to overcome them rapidly. Bearing in mind the ideological aspects of all of these texts, should we perhaps see some of this imagery as hearkening back to figures like Thutmose? He's the swift and decisive pharaoh who achieves great victory.
Yes, very much. And there's a couple of things to unpack there. On the one hand, Sety's, what I call chariot diplomacy of his campaign of year one, which may also be echoed in Ramses' first campaign of victory, which actually happens in his 4th year, which is right before his Kadesh campaign, and perhaps also Merneptah's Canaanite campaign recorded at Karnak, may be cases of these sort of military tours. And they actually perhaps correspond to some of Thutmose III's later campaigns, which in his study of Thutmose III's campaigns, Donald Redford uses this term for some of the medieval campaigns called chevauchés, or horse campaigns or marchabouts, where basically it was just, sort of almost like, ancient medieval, motorcycle gangs riding around and raising hell. But that some of these campaigns were really just marchabouts, and just overwhelming force going around and seeking homage and picking on weak states that offered some resistance. Now, the other thing is interesting, this idea of rebellion, because we hear about it so often. And one of the things you see here, and regardless of whether you or I would say that some of these enemies were truly rebelling against Egyptian interests, from an ideological standpoint, any real or perceived opposition to Egypt's interests, or even when the Egyptians simply were looking for a fight, they would always cast opposition to Pharaoh's rule as a rebellion. And even independent states who were clearly outside of the Pharaoh's power, such as the Hittites or Mitanni in the 18th dynasty, would be cast as rebels. And this was an ideological conceit. In fact, the Italian scholar Mario Lavorani, who has studied all of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, sees the same theme among the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Mitanni, that opposition to the king, whoever the king is, who theoretically is the ruler of the entire world, is automatically rebellion. So if the Pharaoh is theoretically the ruler of the entire world, any kingdom, no matter how great or small, that opposes him, they are automatically a rebel. And so we always hear the Hittite king is a rebel, the Mitanni king is a rebel, as well as some petty king who clearly is a vassal is also a rebel.
Interesting. It's one of those examples where history does not seem to change that much in terms of how states interact when they are interested in a fight.
But it's also an example of how understanding the ideology also helps us to parse how we should understand these documents in terms of history. Because I also think that with getting back to Sety's first campaign, when he gets out there on his first campaign, he has to fulfill his ideological role of suppressing chaos, of chastising rebellion, and fulfilling his military, getting his military credentials. And he's itching for a fight. He's looking for trouble. He's looking for somebody to beat up. For all those things, this is about an ideological exercise. And so the whole motive for the first campaign is to fulfill his ideological role. And that's driving him, as it were, to war, and even ginning up war when it isn't otherwise necessary.
And I suppose that's best encapsulated in the start of the year one campaign text, where Sety supposedly receives news of the rebellion, and it takes a few lines to describe how excited and overjoyed he is at the prospect of bloodshed and going forth.
Well, at first he's outraged that how dare they rebel against my majesty, and then he has this bloodlust, and then he's basically, I'm just going to destroy them. But again, it's a familiar trope. This idea that somebody comes to report, that these foreigners are rebellion, but it's a trope. It's part of the ideological narrative. It's a well-worn theme, and Sety, it's part of the script. And again, these were just some Bedouin. They probably were always causing problems from an Egyptian perspective. But again, it's blown up into this big deal, and the Pharaoh goes off and bashes his head.
Very good. So putting that into the wider context of what you've said about Sety, and sort of wrapping this all up together into a cohesive whole, if that's possible. It seems very much like from the grander historiographical perspective, Sety takes the classic features of his predecessors, especially the more notable great rulers who he sometimes consciously models himself on. He takes those traditional features, adds his own layer of sometimes novel or unique imagery and interpretation, but essentially brings it into a cohesive whole where he becomes, if you will, the ultimate Pharaoh, that has ever existed and ever will exist. Would that be a fair summation of what Sety, by the end of his reign, is trying to present himself as?
Yes, of course, up until Ramses II. But yes, I think so. And I would say, too, that, often he's seen as one of the greatest pharaohs, obviously, again. And of course, looking back, I say about Ramses II that he was a hard act to proceed. So Sety is obviously dwelling in the shadow that's cast backwards by his son. But to the extent that Sety is one of the greatest pharaohs, so we shouldn't view Sety as having reconquered the empire that Akhenaten supposedly had lost. It's not because he was restoring the temples that had been completely destroyed and neglected since the death of Akhenaten. All these things, but because yes, he was an innovative pharaoh. Yes, he had undertook this great building project, but it's also because he actually, very much like Ramses, was actually one of the masters of PR. I mean, he did all these things, but he also he promoted himself. He also created this spectacular image of kingship. Again, that Ramses then amplified to the nth degree, and he set this standard for kingship that obviously Ramses emulated and expanded on. And again, one could only imagine, had Sety ruled for another 10 or 20 years, whether we would be talking about Sety the Great. And if Sety had just managed to live even for a few more years, some of the monuments that Ramses was famous for, such as the facade of Luxor Temple with those giant obelisks and the four great seated colossi and the pylon gateway that I believe Sety had commissioned, and they would have been completed in his name. The entire hypostyle hall would have been completely decorated throughout with these beautiful bas-reliefs of Sety I, with no inscriptions of Ramses II, unless Ramses had chosen to reinscribe them, and then it would have been obvious that Ramses had never decorated any of it originally himself. The entire Sety, the temple at Abydos, again, would have been completely decorated by Sety. Who knows what other monuments he would have built? And again, this would have changed the complexion. So there's this sense of what might have been had Sety even lived 2 or 3 or 5, to say nothing of 10 or 20 years more.
Excellent. So if we were to summarize that in a soundbite, could we perhaps say that Sety ran so that Ramesses could sprint?
Yes. And he's almost like some of these other fathers of great kings. One thinks of Philip of Macedon to Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar to Augustus, Snefru to Khufu. The predecessors of great kings that were in some ways great themselves, but were then overshadowed by their progeny.
Very good. So, Professor Brand, that brings me to the end of all of my questions and more about Sety I. It has been a marathon of a conversation. Thank you for your energy and enthusiasm. I hope I have not taken too much time from you.
Oh, no, not at all.
I hope you've enjoyed discussing this king, even though we are currently building to Ramesses II, the ultimate pharaoh, if you will.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
And we will see you very soon to discuss Ramesses II and to speak more about your book. So I guess all I can say is thank you very much for your time, and I hope the next few weeks until I speak to you again are good weather and good blessings upon you.
Looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you very much. I'll speak soon. That brings us to the end of this interview with Professor Peter Brand. But there will be more in the future as we begin to explore the reign of Ramesses II, to which Peter has devoted a spectacular amount of time and writing. If you are interested in his books, you can find links to them in the episode description. The monuments of Sety I and Ramesses II, Egypt's ultimate pharaoh, are both valuable explorations of this political and historical period. I highly recommend them. That's all from me. I'll see you soon as we return to our regularly scheduled programming. Thanks for listening, and may Osiris of Abydos and Sety I, who is Osiris, bless you and yours.